Joining me now in the studio is James Marlow, a foreign affairs expert. Welcome to the programme. First of all, we're expecting this grand diplomatic gesture, potentially even this week. The government reaching out to countries in the Middle East, trying to get them to spur on production. Are they likely to listen?
Yes, they are likely to listen, yes. But you mentioned the 1970s. I have to tell you, I'm old enough to remember those lights out to the early 1970s as well. Petrol rationing and us giving just 1 minute to go ahead and find the candles, find the matches. 1973 war, of course, where OPEC, Saudi was the main player at that time, holding back oil to the west until Israel withdrew from certain Syrian territory. Speed forward to 2022 today. The players have changed, but there's a very similar circumstances. Of course, it's no longer Saudi in the picture, it's Russia in the picture. With regard to Saudi itself, I have to tell you, a lot of people around the world, a lot of companies, corporations, governments, they have no problem with dealing with China. They say, you know what, China is the one who we need the goods from. China is the one who produces much cheaper. Yet we see that over the last few years, their human rights record has not been fantastic. That's putting it mildly, of course. 1.5 million Uyghur Muslims, at the very least, in detention camps. At the most, some of them being killed. Yet we still say we need those goods from China. We don't raise an eyebrow. When Saudi comes into the picture, then people start to raise an, and I'm certainly not a spokesperson on behalf of Saudi Arabia, I can assure you that. But it's interesting to see where there is it's the same players are involved. China is a human rights abuser, and yet we're talking about, well, we mustn't take oil from Saudi.
I wonder, though, in the context of where we are now, the reason we are experiencing some of this expected inflation in terms of oil and gas price, we're wanting to punish a bad regime. We're wanting Russia to stop behaving in the way it is, in the medieval way, in some ways, that it is, in this sort of spheres of influence policy it's trying to pursue. Is there a worry that we're being slightly contradictive with ourselves there if we swap one despotic regime for one that literally beheads its prisoners? Yeah,
absolutely. I think so. You know, just to step back, global consumption is around 100 million barrels of oil a day. That's an incredible amount of barrels of oil, although the price has gone down a little bit today, but we're still in that very difficult territory. Inflation is rising. Some people say by the time the summer comes, we'll be up to 10%, which is outrageous. But in terms of Russian output in their oil, they kept, out of the 10 million barrels a day, they kept 4 million for themselves. They exported 6 million. Of course, the United States today is no longer taking that. We in Britain and the EU still relying on those barrels of oil. That means those governments have to find another 6 million barrels a day from somewhere else. Venezuela and Iran is where Biden is looking from. And I have to tell you, once again, you're dealing with regimes that have horrendous human rights abuses against their own people. Biden is desperate now for another Iran deal in order to lift those sanctions completely.
And I suppose there's a difference there between, at least with Saudi Arabia, formally, the West is allied to it in terms of foreign policy.
And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. Exactly that. And I'd much rather do business with Saudi than Iran, because one of the big problems that Obama did, and I don't want to go off too much on a tangent, but one of the big problems is that this Iran deal, which was supposed to curb their nuclear weapon ambition, in fact, I believe it's actually enhanced its nuclear weapon ambition, because they were still allowed, I'm talking about Iran, they were still allowed to spin the centrifuges. They were still allowed to enrich uranium. They had no cuts whatsoever on the international ballistic missiles. Now, international ballistic missiles can already reach the Middle East, can already reach Israel and Saudi and the Gulf states, can already reach Eastern Europe. Those international ballistic missiles, which Iran is building, and by the way, this new deal still doesn't mention it at all whatsoever. They're aimed for Paris, they're aimed for London, they're aimed for Berlin, and possibly Washington, D.C.
I remember not so long ago, President George H.W. Bush, no, not H.W., George W. Bush talked about that axis of evil, the axis of evil speech after 9/11, where he spoke about Iraq and Iran and North Korea.
And
I wonder if we're having a new axis of evil now. Potentially, the risk is if we lean in to somewhere like Iran, they might be more allied with Russia than we realise.
Before Trump put sanctions on Iran, they were producing 200 million barrels. Excuse me, not 200. It was, I've got to look down on my figures over here. Iran was producing 2 million barrels of oil per day. Since the sanctions came in, it's 1 million barrels of oil a day. Now, again, the West is hoping that Iran will push that up. I think we have to realize that one of the reasons why we got into this situation as well is also, the whole thing is linked in, pandemic. There was a massive lowering of consumption for oil all over the world, which we saw. All of a sudden, we suddenly need a lot more. Those oil wells were shut down. Now we suddenly need, that's why prices have gone up. Of course, the Russian war have not helped the situation as well. And just end up, because I can see in your eyes, we've got to wrap up over here, to end up, I'd much rather do business with Saudi than with Iran. And if you want to say Saudi is a bad country, yes, it is. But look at Venezuela, look at China, and look at the other countries as well that we're dealing with.
It seems like it's going to be a lesser of multiple evils option. I wouldn't envy the position of the Prime Minister this week, or indeed over the last few weeks either. Well, thank you for coming into the studio, and thank you for talking through all of those very intricate issues in the Middle East and beyond there. Of course, James Marlow, Foreign Affairs expert. Now to